Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everybody, and hello to those who are watching remotely on the video. Before I start my talk, I'd just like to draw your attention to some of the features of this room. For those mariners amongst you, you'll be very familiar with the international flags that adorn, and for those ancient mariners of you, you will probably recognize the semaphore ingrained in the woodwork there. So it's a bit of a reminder. So I was just looking to see which button I should press. As Mike mentioned, the Hoegh Osaka capsized, and I had prepared a version of this talk for a conference I was chairing last week. Unfortunately, I've been able to adapt it, perhaps with a slightly more severe bent. Unfortunately, the MAIB report, that's the Marine Accident Investigation Bureau here in the UK, their report is completed and it's now going through the process of people who are mentioned in it or possibly even criticised in it are having to review it. So we can expect it to be published reasonably soon. But it was for those cameramen amongst you, it was a very photogenic incident, and it was in the full view of more or less everyone in the Solent area. Essentially, this is what happened. She sailed Southampton in a normal way on the 3rd of January, but just as she sailed, I understand, and a lot of this is my information, not official information, but I understand the pilot made a comment to the master that she felt a bit tender and she had a slight lisp leaving the berth. That may or may not be true. However, what happened next is true. You can probably see the map there. That's as far as she got. And the interesting thing is that the ship beached on what is known as the Bramble Bank. Now, those of you who know the South Coast well enough will know that the Bramble Bank is a feature of the entrance to Southampton Water. It is quite famous because at low water springs in the summer, people go out there to play cricket. And they have this completely crazy cricket match, and as the tide comes up, you'll see guys in wellies playing cricket. Anyway, the ship carried on down to Southampton Water, developed as it went round the bank. She assumed a very large angle of heel. Now, whether or not the ship was beached or whether she grounded, we will find out when the MAIB report comes out. There's no doubt at all that she ended up on the ground at an angle in excess of 50, that's 50 degrees, at which time some of the cargo on board shifted. She had a cargo of Jaguar motor cars and some heavy lift equipment. And I've got a photograph a bit later just to show you. That is one of the early pictures, and not a particularly good one, but you can just get an idea, I think, from that, the sort of angle she was at. And that was taken early next morning. Interestingly, the pilot, whilst he was on the bridge, had taken his jacket off, his weather jacket. And at the time of the incident, he had been separated from his jacket, and of course pilots' jackets contain life jackets. So here was a poor old pilot on the bridge of a ship at 50 odd degrees without his life jacket. Fortunately, the small boat you see there had Port Authority people on it, and they were able to manoeuvre right up to the bridge, recover his life jacket and give it back to him. whence he went off. Incidentally, there was only one injury during the incident. One of the crew members broke his leg. And this is the cargo I was talking about, heavy plant. And I do understand that the securing of that cargo is subject to the MAIB investigation. What they will find is too early to say. Now, the salvage took place under a Lloyd's open form. I don't know whether Scopic was invoked or not. In any event, it wasn't necessary. But I spoke with the salvage master, Bram Sperling of Svitzer, now Ardent, who at least was able to highlight me in some of the issues he felt. They knew there had been water ingress, but they needed to find out where it had come in from and how much there was. They were obviously, as all salvers, were aware of the free surface dynamics, so they needed to find out where the free water was. They ended up, as you might imagine, pumping, but as they were pumping, they realized water was still coming in. So they had to take some action then, as I understand it, to stem the flow. Once they had done that, it worked, and we saw what happened. She was stabilized and ultimately redelivered. It was interesting. Those of you who followed this will be aware that the original refloating was delayed because of the onset of bad weather. However, the ship was having none of it and refloated itself. Well, it came afloat, and there was a minor panic whilst they got tugs in the right place to stop her drifting off anywhere else. Now, many of you will be aware that when an incident like this happens, people get involved in investigating it. Indeed, I imagine many of you here and those watching will be or will have been involved in casualty investigation. Now, but the official investigations in the UK, as I mentioned, we have the MAIB. In the US, we have the Coast Guard. Australia, we have the Australian Maritime or Marine Safety Agency. And in South Africa, we have the South African Marine Safety Authority. So they're all as examples of bodies who will have a legal requirement to conduct investigations. Now, I can speak for the MAIB in that theirs is not a witch hunt. Their investigation is to try and establish what happened, why it happened, and what lessons can be learned. If there's any prosecution to be followed, that will be undertaken separately by the MCA, that's the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency in the UK. In different jurisdictions, sometimes the accident investigation is linked to the criminal investigation. Indeed, there's an incident ongoing in Italy as we speak where the police have stopped any salvage type or recovery type action from taking place until they have completed their information. And Nick mentioned yesterday the circumstances of the Costa Concordia. So it's always something that surveyors have to bear in mind, because interfering with evidence in a crime scene is in itself an offence. Has anyone here been to jail for that sort of offence? No, we're lucky. We have a fine body of IIMS surveyors, but it is something you must bear in mind. Indeed, in the UK, there was a dispute between the investigating police and the MAIB, who had right of access. Both said they had the priority. Common sense has prevailed. Indeed, when there is an incident involving the possibility of crime, the MAIB and the investigating police authorities will liaise very closely and preserve evidence. And indeed, as Nick mentioned yesterday on the Costa Concordia, evidence saving, evidence collection was a matter of common sense, slightly adjusted for the local circumstances. In the UK, I concentrate on the MAIB because that's obviously the body I know best, but I do appreciate nearly every other jurisdiction has its own legal requirements to accident investigation. And it is a statutory duty on the MAIB to conduct the investigation. There is a legal framework, as I've said. I've mentioned the issue of access at the casualty and what their purpose is. The first task of any investigator, and most of you guys will know this only too well, is to identify the areas of concern. Now, sometimes that's very obvious, because the ship's been on fire, there's a burnt out ship and containers. But in terms of the Hoegh Osaka, I would suggest that one of the things the MAIB will have investigated very closely is the ballast management. Now, many of you here will be only too aware that on container ships and car carriers and that sort of ship, the vessel has to be kept pretty well upright during the whole operation. And that is done automatically by the computer. And I wonder if anyone on the ship had ever actually conducted their own soundings just to check the computer. Or did the computer say no? It's a fact of modern seafaring on these ships that the computerized ballast system is integral to the safe loading, carriage and discharge of cargo. Were there any written procedures? If there were, and there should have been of course, were they followed? And if they were followed, what went wrong? If they were not followed, then you have a clue down the investigation side. Who did what and when? What were the crew tasks on the ship? What did they actually have to do? It was interesting. Some of you here will remember when you were ballasting a tank, one of the ways you determined when the tank was full, you saw the water coming out of the vent. And that was a pretty good idea that it was full. But when the computer says it's full, is it actually full? We don't really, well, we do know, and we can find out. And the various roles and responsibilities. Now, going back to the investigation, I'm certain that the MAIB will have looked at the stability of the ship on leaving the berth. Now, on a personal basis, no sound, seaworthy ship takes on a 50-degree angle of heel without something serious having gone wrong. So what did the stability calculation on the Hoegh Osaka say? Well, we don't know yet, but I suspect when the MAIB report comes out, we will find out to satisfy all our curiosity. And the other point, of course, were the assumptions fed into the computer, if they were fed in indeed, were they correct? So this is the sort of thing, you guys as surveyors will be all too aware of that. I've mentioned the cargo, the water ingress, and the role of the ship's crew. This is the tricolour. I think she actually ended up, as you can see, on her side. And who investigated that? That was a few years ago. Now this is the Cougar Ace. She adopted that angle of heel and was recovered. She was salvaged. The very sad thing about that particular case was that one of the salvage crew didn't clip himself on quite properly and went from the top to the bottom and sadly died. That's our old friend again, the Hoegh Osaka, and you can see quite an alarming angle of heel. Now, this is perhaps where you surveyors come into it. Who else will conduct an investigation? Well, the commercial interests, of course. They want, at the bottom line, it's all about money. So owners, charterers, and anyone else who may have a direct interest in the voyage will conduct an investigation. Now, what is interesting, one of the ships I got involved with many years ago was a container ship that had broken in two. The bow section sank, but the stern section was towed to safety in Las Palmas, I think it was. 47 surveyors turned up. And I'm not joking, we counted them. As they said, we counted them all in, we counted them all out. But what it does raise, from the surveying point of view, when you do have this sort of casualty, and the ship is still there, is the question of surveyor safety. And indeed, on one casualty, I was asked by the owner to organise the surveyors. And we had a tag-on, tag-off type system, which is fine when you have to go up a ladder to gain access, but one ship was actually alongside and you could just step on and step off. And some surveyors seem to have no concept of their own safety. They were wandering around the ship trying to score brownie points over their opposition, placing themselves in danger, because what they didn't know was that part of the ship was still on fire and there was lots of toxic fumes around. The other people at the bottom there, I say, who will be conducting the investigation, in addition to the statutory one, if necessary, will be the port authorities. And it can be a real jungle. Fortunately, with our case, the Hoegh Osaka, because she was offshore at an extreme angle of heel, access was simply denied. And Lord Donaldson mentioned this after the Sea Empress, when they had to evacuate 42 people from the ship in an emergency situation, that sometimes there are far too many people on board. So access is a very major point to any incident. Many of you are based locally, and the first attendee at a major casualty is very likely to be the surveyor based at or near the port. Now, they will be guys like ourselves. However, sometimes the cause of a casualty is a matter of science, and you will have fire experts, chemical experts, and others coming out, metallurgical guys coming out to try and help the investigation, or depending, try and hinder the investigation. I shouldn't have said that really, but it's just a fact of life. And it's always incumbent upon the local guys, in my view, to help the expert surveyors. And I put at the bottom is the lawyers. And this has changed. Casualty response has changed over the last 35 years beyond recognition. The first job I ever did in big one was in Libya, and not a lawyer was to be seen. Later on, we had another major casualty in Mogadishu, and I have to say that Archbishop of Holman Fenwick, he turned up, and he was first there, but he didn't stay long because we then turned up and took over. But the attendance of lawyers at casualties is now, certainly big casualties, is inevitable. And the thing to do is make sure you know which party the lawyer is representing. He knows which party you've been appointed by. I'm teaching granny to suck eggs to a certain extent, but it is important to have the casualty investigation conducted in a, what I would say, seaman-like fashion. I say here, what motivates? Well, at the end of the day, and others may disagree with this, but it's in the commercial world, it's all about money. Safety sometimes takes second place. Now, with the state investigations, it's the other way around. They don't care who has to or may have to pay for what, but the safety issues are what they're primarily interested in. And talking about safety and casualty investigation, I'm going to make a plug for, and it's a book that was one of the forefathers of the IIMS books, Casualty Management Guidelines. If anyone would like to buy a copy, I have the leaflets here, and you're very welcome to take one. Because casualty management is something that the surveyor may or may not be aware of. When there's a major casualty, or even sometimes minor casualties, there, as I mentioned, up to 47 people turn up. How on earth do you manage that? And hopefully in this book there are some guidelines. I hope I've caught up some of the time, Mike, and I will take questions afterwards when we don't have coffee outside, but I'll hover around. Thank you.